We have spoken many times with Russian President Vladimir Putin about the fact that it is absolutely unacceptable for the war between Ukraine and Russia to spill over into Belarusian territory. It is extremely dangerous for NATO to get involved in these processes in Ukraine right now. It simply must not happen. They could provoke not just an escalation, they could provoke a nuclear conflict. Israel also needs to, as we say, take stock and think about its further survival. Otherwise, even nuclear weapons won't help them.
Putin's close ally, described by many analysts as nuclear-armed due to Belarus hosting of Russian tactical nuclear weapons and extensive military integration with Moscow, has recently taken actions that have reignited fears in Western capitals about the real risk of nuclear confrontation with NATO, sparking fresh debate over escalation control and deterrence measures. In an unusually conciliatory move, a prominent Putin ally issued a rare apology to Kiev, signaling a brief diplomatic opening as Belarus simultaneously stepped forward to advocate for direct negotiations. Belarus appears to be dialing back its earlier war rhetoric and publicly urging negotiations over both the Ukraine conflict and wider Middle Eastern wars, a shift that proponents say could create space for diplomacy even as skeptics warn the move may reflect Minsk's attempt to reposition itself within a complex regional and international landscape. Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko publicly asserted that his country poses no military threat to Ukraine, insisting that Minsk seeks to avoid direct confrontation while emphasizing its stated commitment to regional stability and escalating rhetoric. Lukashenko also issued an apology to Ukraine's president for earlier harsh remarks, framing the gesture as a corrective to past rhetoric and an attempt to open a more constructive channel of communication between the two capitals. The president of Belarus said, and I quote, "If Volodymyr Alexandrovich was offended, I apologize to him for these words. No military action should be expected from Belarus, and especially from me," unquote. Lukashenko said his earlier comments were made in direct response to what Minsk described as alleged threats emanating from Ukraine, arguing that his statements were defensive reactions meant to counter perceived provocations rather than gratuitous aggression. Reports indicate that one of the threats Moscow and Minsk cited was Kiev's purported identification of hundreds of potential targets inside Belarus, a claim presented as justification for heightened Belarusian vigilance and stronger security posturing along its border. A Ukrainian commander publicly warned Lukashenko to refrain from intervening in the Russia-Ukraine war, delivering a blunt message that any direct Belarusian involvement would carry serious consequences and escalate the conflict further. Lukashenko answered that warning by threatening to strike what he characterized as a very serious target inside Ukraine, language meant to signal capability and resolve while increasing pressure on Kiev to avoid actions Minsk deemed intolerable. That exchange followed repeated warnings from Ukraine's president, who has consistently cautioned against Belarusian escalation and emphasized Kiev's readiness to respond to any moves that would broaden the war. Zelensky has asserted that Russia is actively attempting to draw Belarus more directly into the conflict, alleging that Moscow seeks to open an additional front or to use Minsk as a political and military lever to complicate Ukrainian defenses and international support. Meanwhile, despite the tensions and sharp rhetoric, Lukashenko publicly urged negotiators to pursue talks to resolve both the war in Ukraine and ongoing conflicts in the Middle East, presenting diplomacy as a preferred avenue even while maintaining strong military rhetoric as leverage.
We have spoken many times with Russian President Vladimir Putin about the fact that it is absolutely unacceptable for the war between Ukraine and Russia to spill over into Belarusian territory. There are various reasons for this. I have mentioned two reasons. Firstly, we understand this, which is why we do not want to go to war. Belarus is very vulnerable militarily. If Ukraine were to attack Belarus in the same way as it is attacking Russia, because Belarus is as clear as day to the Ukrainian military, we are well aware that our key infrastructure, industrial and logistical facilities, would come under attack. Well, as they have stated, they have already identified 500 such targets on Belarusian territory. If Russia were to attack Kiev from Belarusian territory, the front line, for Russia, naturally, and for us as well, would be extended by 1,500 kilometers along the Belarusian-Ukrainian border. Given the current course of the war, we and the Russians would be unable to defend this section. Bearing in mind that NATO forces and the countries supporting Ukraine will deploy their troops onto Ukrainian territory, this war will take on a new dimension. It will become a war between Belarus and Russia against the NATO bloc. Although I do not rule out that this could happen even without that. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky cannot withdraw troops from the Donbass, Zaporizhzhia, Kharkov or Lugansk regions to redeploy them to the Belarusian border. That is why we understand who is facing us on the other side. They are former machine operators and ordinary workers, not all of whom even know how to shoot. And are we going to attack them with a professional army? Of course not. That is why he cannot muster any troops there. I even think that if this conflict were to start from Belarusian territory, Ukraine would have nothing to set against it there, apart from drones. They would attack our civilian facilities and our enterprises. He has no men. I wouldn't say that NATO is the one stirring up this mess. It is extremely dangerous for NATO to get involved in these processes in Ukraine right now. It simply must not happen. They could provoke not just an escalation, they could provoke a nuclear conflict. And that would mean, at the very least, the destruction of the whole of Europe or even the entire planet. It is not even in the interests of the United States of America, which is supposedly far away across the ocean. It is not in anyone's interests. I have given a great deal of thought to these 5 points. Why are leading European countries demanding that Russia take extreme and unworkable measures? It's a classic tactic. At the start of a dialogue, you set the bar as high as possible so that you can back down from it later. It seems that European states are already inclined to do so. I think that is their position at the start of the negotiations. Russia's position is also as firm as possible, as has been stated. Now, however, we need to sit down at the negotiating table and bring these positions closer together. To do so, both sides must compromise if we want to end this war. Israel also needs to, as we say, take stock and think about its further survival. Otherwise, even nuclear weapons won't help them. What exactly are you demanding of Iran regarding these nuclear weapons? If we're talking about fairness, does the United States have nuclear weapons? It does. Well, all right, the US has had them for a long time, from the very beginning. However, Israel keeps quiet about the fact that they have nuclear weapons. The Iranians might ask, why can't they have nuclear weapons? Especially when there are nuclear powers nearby, India, Pakistan. Why can't Iran have nuclear weapons? If we're being fair, then let's quietly and gradually eliminate all nuclear weapons in the world. But if it's a deterrent and a guarantee that no one will ever attack you if you have nuclear weapons, well then Iran has the right, just like other countries, to possess these nuclear weapons for its own defense. But that is if we are talking about the nuclear option. As for blocking the Strait of Hormuz, I do not think the Iranians want to stop shipping there. It is not in their interests. If the Strait of Hormuz is blocked, the wealthy Gulf states will find another route. Israel and the US, which attacked Iran, need to consider how they will compensate for this damage. In other words, there are a great many issues here that need to be resolved. And these issues can only be resolved at the negotiating table. There is no military solution to either conflict, neither in Ukraine nor in the Middle East. The idea that countries around the world should possess nuclear weapons is a dead end. Sooner or later, a nuclear conflict may break out, and the planet will be destroyed. That is why I am not in favor of countries worldwide possessing these nuclear weapons. I am in favor of nuclear disarmament, and this must apply to everyone. Russia, the United States, China, Israel, India, Pakistan, and other countries. Iran proposed to move out the nuclear materials it had produced, enriched nuclear materials intended for weapons, and suggested moving them out to China or Russia. The Russians made such a proposal. Why did the Americans refuse to allow Iran to send this enriched uranium to China? Why did they refuse? China is a nuclear power. It produces enriched nuclear fuel for nuclear weapons. No one is forbidding China. No one is putting pressure on China. Well, let them take it there. Would it provide a great advantage for China? Absolutely. No, China does not possess the same number of nuclear warheads as Russia and the United States. Well, let them take it to China. Those materials would have been under control. Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, the UAE, and so on. They are all in favor of putting an end to this conflict and starting to establish normal relations. All the countries I have listed have told Trump, we do not want war there. You know why? That is why these objective circumstances are forcing the Americans to pursue diplomatic channels to end the war. None of the United States allies, if they can be called that at present, have come out in favor of prolonging the conflict in order to punish Iran, despite the fact that some countries, such as the UAE, had serious issues with Iran. And I wouldn't say they are friends. Nevertheless, the UAE leadership made it clear to Trump that the war must end. They need to reach an agreement. You could say that some UAVs launched from Iranian territory end up in residential areas. Well, that is either a flaw regarding these UAVs or simply the current reality. Electronic warfare systems are in operation. As a result, the UAVs veer off course and crash. They run out of fuel, or for some other reason they end up falling where they weren't meant to go. We're experiencing this right now from Ukraine and Russia as well. They are fighting each other, but the UAVs are straying into our territory. Just recently, one of the UAVs veered off course, coming straight from Russian territory, the Smolensk region, crashed and exploded on Belarusian territory. This was due to the operation of electronic warfare systems. It's exactly the same there. But Iran is attacking bases of the United States, an aggressor, as they see it, who attacked Iran. What's wrong with that? It all makes sense. So, the United States has attacked Iran. So what? None of the issues they raised, and none of the challenges the Americans needed to address in Iran have been resolved. Quite the opposite. The United States will never embark on a large-scale ground operation, or even a small-scale one, because there would be thousands of American casualties. The U.S. would not make that through, especially given the current situation in the U.S., where the ruling Republican Party is facing opposition. It would have been impossible to drag the U.S. into this conflict if they hadn't wanted it themselves. They believed that they could solve any problem by military means. Just fire off some missiles, and everything will be fine. No, so it's true. Israel provoked the United States.